Hello and welcome back to Hyperplay RPG. Metaphor ReFantazio is the JRPG on everyone's lips at the moment, coming as it does from the creative minds behind Persona 5 Royal and published by Atlas. Metaphor ReFantazio promised to be the anti-Persona. But is it really a huge evolution from the well-loved Persona 5 formula? Or is this much more a reskinning in a medieval setting? Well, we got some surprising answers for you. And in amongst all the amazing accolades that the game's been getting, we're going to add a bit of balance here. And we're going to say why you might think twice before ploughing up to 90 hours into Metaphor ReFantazio. Now don't get us wrong, we're not looking to be negative, but your time is precious and we just want to make sure that this game is going to be exactly what you want. Yes, the critics have been gushing in their praise, lavishing 9s and 10s on Metaphor ReFantazio across the board. However, there are two camps who may well end up being disappointed if they decide to take the plunge into Metaphor ReFantazio's world, and those are the RPG fans who adored the first 40 hours of Persona 5 but then found it dragging interminably as it reached its many conclusions. And then there are those who loved Persona 5 all the way through and thought it the coolest thing ever and were excited to see what new direction Atlas would take their formula in. And the overlap here between our two groups of previous Persona 5 players is that both sets are looking for something new in Metaphor ReFantazio. All of which is a rather long-winded way of saying we're going to see whether Metaphor ReFantazio is worth your time if you are looking for something new. Beyond the tried and tested, whether that's in terms of the Persona 5 formula or the fantasy setting in which Metaphor ReFantazio is firmly rooted. So we're going to explode some myths and kick those critics into the dust who just demand that you buy this game without actually telling you whether you're really going to enjoy it. Now, in amongst all the critical gushing in praise of the game is one dissenting voice, and that is the legendary British games journalist Matthew Castle. Matthew worked on more UK Nintendo mags than he had takeaway hot dinners, and that's saying something, many of which he prolonged the life of all the way up to their conclusion. And in a podcast released today, the latest issue of Backpage Pod, a video games podcast that Matthew co-hosts with his sidekick, Samuel Roberts, Matthew had some very interesting things to say about Metaphor ReFantazio, coming to it as a fan of Persona 5 Royal. Matthew noted that many of the elements he loved in Persona 5 Royal are very much present and correct in Metaphor ReFantazio, such as the social links, and the need to level up your confidence in the people you meet around the game world to improve your stats. And he noted this is very much present and correct in Metaphor ReFantazio, in the form of follower bonds. In fact, Matthew went on to note a number of similarities between the two games, very much to his disappointment. Indeed, Matthew was rather coruscating in his criticism of the gameplay loop, labelling it nothing more than a reskin of Persona 5's tried and tested approach. And yes, you may cry there are differences, there are archetypes instead of persona, and the game world is medieval in its tone. But even then Matthew had a problem, because he says that the medieval world has been seen before in 100 different types of JRPGs, traipsing through medieval towns and settings, and indeed the environments look drab. The dungeons have also come in for criticism in Metaphor ReFantazio, being labelled linear, drab, and indeed boring. And that would be the word that Matthew in the podcast today says the most often. He describes the gameplay of Metaphor ReFantazio as boring. Bear in mind that King Castle is an avid fan of Persona 5 Royal, declaring it to be the coolest game known to humanity, but he says that the shift to the medieval setting has cost the gameplay a lot of its coolness. These aren't kids acting up and setting the world to rights, they're adults. But even then, Metaphor ReFantazio does not follow through on the adult premise of its characters, and there's absolutely no romancing and very little that would differentiate these characters from the children of previous Atlas games. A big disappointment. Now, we believe the biggest counter to this argument is in the archetype structure. Gone are the demon-fusing ways of Persona 5 Royal, and this is, we would say, the biggest change for Metaphor ReFantazio. Now you don't have to worry and have the anxiety that you're not getting the best personae by fusing them the correct way, you can go ahead and level up your archetypes, you can switch the jobs around, and it's a much more fulfilling system with which to tinker. But even then you come up against comparisons with Persona 5, because what these archetypes effectively do is buff and debuff, and they have their elemental strengths and weaknesses just like Persona 5's demons. So really not such a big change after all. But then again, in Metaphor ReFantazio, a lot of the boss fights will require you to have the right archetype doing the right thing. Another complaint about Metaphor ReFantazio, and where it differs in this instance from Persona 5, is in its one-note setting. Gone is the ability to spend 50% of your time in the real world and 50% in the mythic, the metaverse, like you did in Persona 5. Here, everything is set in the Metaphor ReFantazio game world. There is no metaverse. And if you're in love with the setting, then great. But if you do find it drab and you've seen it and done it all before in these medieval type scenarios, then you may be wishing for something a little bit more, even if you are a staunch Persona 5 fan. And what about the nuts and bolts of the combat system? Well, Gone is the one more turn approach of Persona 5, and you might think great, an evolution, and yet it is rather a half turn now in Metaphor ReFantazio system, and that is much more akin to Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne, so again it's been seen before. Aha, you may say, but here we have real-time combat mixed with turn-based combat, and that is a change indeed, but does it actually make a huge amount of difference? Not until you get to late in the game where you want to go back over old ground and trash the old trash mobs, but until then it really has very little use, as you can see from the text on screen here. And from this gameplay footage, because if you don't finish off the enemy straight away, which 90% of the time you won't, you then enter into turn-based combat and you might start at a disadvantage if the enemy hits you first. So this new major real-time action battle change is actually something of a gimmick and isn't that important at all. When it comes down to it, for better or worse, your battles are going to be very similar to those in Persona 5, which may make you, like Joker and Co on screen here, want to run away. On the plus side, there's no mementos, but as said, the dungeons have been described as boring, tedious and rather linear in Metaphor ReFantazio. And of course, Metaphor ReFantazio, like Persona 5, is going to put the clock on your ass. There's an election at stake, and whilst it's pretty bare bones in terms of its storytelling, yes, there'll be hustings and fetch quests, if you like that kind of thing, you're going to have to do it all within the usual period of time. So if that brings you anxiety, it might be another reason to steer clear of Metaphor ReFantazio. In short, you're going to have to juggle your time, and some gameplay story segments that are absolutely crucial must be completed within a certain point in Metaphor ReFantazio, or you're going to get the dreaded game over. That said, if the idea of charging around generic medieval cities, like the one on screen now, is your cup of tea on a time limit, then Metaphor ReFantazio should be right up your alley. Now, we don't want to be down on the game, it's obviously a very good game, but all we've seen is immense praise for Metaphor ReFantazio. And it does remind us of when Persona 5 came out, not the royal version, the first game on PS3 and PS4, and again, praise was unanimous for the game. A lot of reviewers hadn't actually got round to completing it, so well, they didn't often mention that in their reviews, but time has since shown that the bloated endgame of Persona 5 was never properly mentioned in reviews, and subsequently a lot of people came out and said, yeah, there's a problem with Persona 5. It's too long, it drags, it should have ended on the arc before all the rest of it that went on, and then even Persona 5 Royale with the extra stuff right at the end. A lot of people simply couldn't face it. I, for one, a hardened, seasoned JRPG player, could not face slogging through that final aspect added by Persona 5 Royal. And for the few who have actually got round to completing Metaphor ReFantazio already, a common complaint will be that it does outstay its welcome. It does drag, just like Persona 5 did. And I think we'll see in a year's time a similar case whereby, and this is what Matthew Castle says as well, in a year's time people will reconsider Metaphor ReFantazio and say, it's not perfect, it's a good game, but there are definite flaws and weaknesses. And that is what we've tried to point out in this video, not because we want to be down on the game, but, you know, it's your hard-earned money, and we want to make sure you spend it wisely. And one last thing which may be important to you is that the performance of the game isn't great. In fact, it runs better on PS4 than PS5. So what are your thoughts on Metaphor ReFantazio? Is it just a reskin of Persona 5 with some of the best bits taken out, the coolness of the kids, and reskinned in a bland medieval setting? Or is it truly a revolution? Perhaps this is exactly what you wanted, at the heart of it more Persona 5 goodness, but in an entirely new world. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Talking of the comments, we'll also put the link into the excellent Backpage Pod edition with Matthew Castle's thoughts on the game. Definitely worth a listen, strongly recommended. And that's it from us. If this was at all interesting to you, please tickle all the buttons. And that said, please take care, happy RPGing, and thanks for watching. Goodbye.